So why is forest management good for carbon? If you're aware of the conversations around forests and forest management right now, you'll know that carbon is a big topic of conversation. Forests are really good at sequestering carbon, pulling it out of the atmosphere, and also storing carbon. And we know that forests' ability to sequester and store carbon is going to be really important as we try to attenuate some of the worst effects of climate change. Now, while that can sound all really remote and scientific, it's important to remember that carbon in the forest is not something that you would have like in a beaker in a lab. Carbon is wood. Trees are absorbing carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere with their leaves and through the process of photosynthesis, transforming it into sugars and starches, which are then becoming wood and leaves and roots. When that tree dies and starts to decompose, some of that carbon remains stored in the soil as organic carbon, essentially rotted wood, while some of that carbon is also re-released into the atmosphere, which is a natural process. Interestingly, if we're thinking about the carbon in the forest as just wood, we would think that most of that carbon would be stored in the massive trunks of the trees that are out here. Actually, about 60% of the carbon in most forests in Vermont is stored in the soil. The relationship between carbon and forest management can be really confusing. Part of that is because the research suggests that the best way to store the maximum amount of carbon in the short term is just to not manage forests. And that's basically for two reasons. One is that when we do forest management, we're pulling trees out of the woods, so we're removing carbon from that system. And the other reason is that when we cause soil disturbance, when we create larger openings in the canopy, that can cause some of the carbon that's stored in the soil to be lost, which just means that higher temperatures and soil disturbance create conditions whereby that soil carbon is decomposed and released into the atmosphere. So now you're probably saying we should just not manage our forests, right? Because we need to make sure that they're storing the maximum amount of carbon. So we need to remember that the forest's ability to sequester and store carbon is not some remote abstract thing. It's the ability of that forest to continue to photosynthesize. The ability of a forest to sequester and store carbon in the long term is a function of its ability to be healthy and resilient. So while we can just not manage a beech monoculture or an unhealthy white pine monoculture, or even just a forest that's been degraded by generations of high grading, while we can pretend that that's a good way to store carbon, that's a short-term solution. In order to make these forests healthier in the long term, which will ultimately allow them to sequester and store carbon in the long term, we might have to do things like manage them. This is a 3-acre patch cut that I made in 2017 in an area that was a diseased beech monoculture. Now in the short term, an opening of this size caused some of that soil carbon to be volatilized and turned into aerial carbon, which is a short-term carbon loss. In the long term, creating an opening of this size allowed me to break out of that beech monoculture and to regenerate a diversity of different species, which will ultimately make this forest more resilient and more able to sequester and store carbon in the future, in addition to providing habitat for a wide range of different organisms, which we also need to remember are also vulnerable and also under threat and also integral to the function of this ecosystem. In the short term, the management that we do might cause a little carbon to be released from that system, or for that forest to temporarily have less carbon than it did before. If we're doing management in the right way, we're helping that forest develop the qualities that it needs to grow, to be healthy, and ultimately to sequester and store carbon in the long term. So if we allow ourselves to be seduced by these simple ideas like not managing a forest is always the best solution for our climate, you'll miss what's really true, which is that forest management can actually be an asset to both the resilience of this forest, the community that lives here, and also its ability to be the greatest asset in a changing climate. Please like and subscribe.